Many years ago, another book dealer offered me a book. He told me it was extremely rare, as most copies had been burnt, destroyed. Usually when you hear that, you're talking about books that were published 100 years ago or more. I said, what is it? What's it called? He said, it's called the Maaneh Le'igros. This is the copy. I bought it from him. Of course I bought it from him. It's by a man called Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Does it look old to you? It's not old. It was published in 1973. Who is he? Why is it so rare? When was it published? The Maaneh Le'igros is a book. It's a thick book against the teshuvos of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, published in 1973. And it was so bad, it is so disgraceful in the type of things that it says about Rav Moshe Feinstein, that people burnt it publicly, and no bookshop would carry it. We'll get to that. I bought it, of course, and I read through it. It contains 160, or more than 160, refutations of the teshuvos and the Igros Moshe by Rav Moshe Feinstein. Everyone here, I'm assuming everybody here has heard of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein, I'm going to get back to the Maaneh Le'igros in a bit. I want to spend a couple of minutes to tell you who Rav Moshe Feinstein was. He was born near Minsk in the Russian Empire. His father was a rabbi. He studied under Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. Rabbi Zalman Meltzer was also the father-in-law of Aaron Kotler. He was the Rosh Yeshiva in Slutsk, and later on in Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. He lived until the 1950s. Rav Moshe Feinstein became the Rav. He was such a genius. He became the Rav of Luban, which is in Belarus. It was then in the Russian Empire. He was still single. That's highly unusual for a bocher to become a rabbi in Lithuania. And he got married in 1920. He had 4 children in Russia. By 1936, things were so bad in Russia. The authorities, by the way, when you say authorities in Russia in those days against the Jews, they weren't the Soviet authorities. It was the Yevsektia. It was all Jews. The Jews who wanted to prove themselves to the Soviets would work against the local Jewish community. And they closed schools and shuls and yeshivas and mikvahs. It wasn't possible to function as a religious Jew. So by 1936, he had some family in America, and he moved to the United States. He arrived in 1936 or 37. I'm not exactly clear. He was a Rebbe in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yehuda Levenberg. It was a yeshiva in Cleveland. Also the topic of a very interesting lecture when I ever get to it. The yeshiva closed down sadly in 1938 because Rabbi Yehuda Levenberg died. He had a brain tumor and he died within 3 months. And Rav Moshe Feinstein was left without a job. And he moved to the Lower East Side, where very quickly became the Rosh Yeshiva of a yeshiva in the Lower East Side that had been open for several years. They've recently celebrated their 100th anniversary. And he became the Rosh Yeshiva in this yeshiva on the Lower East Side. It's an interesting place. It still exists. If you ever go to the Lower East Side, it's worth visiting. Rav Moshe Feinstein had a wonderful personality, just a gentle soul. He was very curious, a diligent learner. Nothing was too much for him. And he had this unique combination of having been the Rav for many years of a town, 16 years, and he was also a Rosh Yeshiva, so he had talmidim, and Chavra de Chavra Islay, people began to hear about him, and they began to send him shilas, and his teshuvos, his answers to these halachic queries, questions, were so impressive that very quickly the network of rabbis who would solicit answers from him grew and grew and grew, but it was all very much below the radar. And he made himself very accessible. You could call him on the telephone, he would come to the phone. He didn't have, a coterie of advisors around him who, opening and closing doors and making sure you couldn't get in. You could have access to him. If you knocked on the door of the yeshiva and you went there after Shachris, you asked him a shaila, he would sit with you, give you as much time as you needed. And he was asked halachic questions on every possible topic. And he was original, he was bold, he was fair, he was honest. I'll stress that again. He was honest. That's interesting. He wasn't swayed by things that were going on politically. He wasn't swayed by the moving tides of the Jewish community. He didn't look at you and see how you looked in order to answer your question. you could be a chassid, you could be a litvak, you could be a mechal Shabbos. Didn't make a difference to him. He was going to answer the question. He wrote everything down, wrote copious notes, and in 1959 he published his first volume of teshuvos. It's called Igros Moshe, and he published many volumes after that. They're still now working on new publications of Rav Moshe Feinstein. But at that stage, I have to say, 1959, he wasn't a Gadol Hador, and he wasn't a Posek Hador. He was a rabbi who lived in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, who people who knew about him would come to and ask questions. The Gedolei Hador in America in those days were Reb Aaron Kotler and the Satmar Rebbe. Those were the two. If you came from the Haredi world, whether you were Hasidic, if you were Hasidic, it was the Satmar Rebbe. If you were Litvak, it was Rabbi Aaron Kotler. But clearly, Rav Moshe Feinstein was a Gadol Hador in waiting. I'm not sure there is such a category, I just made it up. And immediately after Rav Aaron Kotler passed away in 1962, he was broadly accepted, and what was interesting is he wasn't just accepted as the Gadol, as it were, the great rabbi of America, just by the Haredi community or just by the Litvak community. The Hasidim accepted him as a Gadol, as the greatest rabbi, and the modern Orthodox community accepted him as the greatest rabbi. He had the broadest possible appeal of a rabbi that it was, we don't have such a rabbi today. Rav Moshe Feinstein was utterly unique. Well, you know what? When somebody's elevated to such a position, people begin to look more carefully at who he is and what he is. Well, you can't find much wrong with Rav Moshe Feinstein, a Bal Midas, a man who can learn, a man who does learn. And yet they began to put his psokim, his halachic decisions, the published ones, under a microscope. And the Satmar Rebbe was extremely unhappy with what he discovered for two reasons. You see, Rav Moshe Feinstein was not just an incredibly brave posek, he was also the posek of choice for leading Hasidic rabbis. If you look at Igros Moshe, no less than 68 prominent Hasidic rabbis have posed questions to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. They didn't go to their own halachic authorities, they went to him. That's competition. We don't like competition, right? And everyone turned to him to resolve thorny halachic issues, and he issued some stunning opinions using a very original style. His style was, I'm not going to look at what all the other rabbis have written about this. I'm going to go back to the source. I'm going to look at the Talmud, Bavli, Yerushalmi. I'm going to look maybe, if I'm not quite sure, at the Rishonim. And based on his discoveries of how these original texts had been interpreted, he would issue a psak, almost as if he was a Rishon, but certainly like an early Achron. And sometimes those decisions went against Achronim, very prominent Achronim. And he wasn't frightened to, in fact, he may not even have known, but even had he known, he wouldn't care, because he felt that he had done it so thoroughly, he'd been through the process so thoroughly, that he was entitled to come up with these ideas. Some of his psokim were very lenient. For example, he said you could have Cholav Stam. What's Cholav Stam? If you don't have to have Cholav Yisrael, it doesn't have to have Shmira from a Jew. Why? Because the FDA in America is sufficient Shmira for milk to make sure that it comes from a cow. Mechitzas, one of the very famous issues in America at that time, was they were trying to separate shuls where men and women sit together, but in order to do so, the mechitzas had to be very low. He issued a psak that the mechitzah, as long as it's a visible separation, can be around 4 foot high. That was incredibly original. He said, if a woman puts her hand out to you to shake your hand, you can shake their hand. Can you imagine a Chassidish Rebbe reading that in Igros Moshe? Others were very strict. For example, he said, you can have no connection with any association, religious or otherwise, with conservative or reform Jews. That's one of his psokim. Another one, he was extremely strict about his application of the laws of Eruv. He felt it's not possible nowadays to have a valid Eruv. He was extremely strict about abortion. At that time, this was becoming an issue, and he was exceptionally strict about his application of Jewish law when it came to that issue. So it's not like he was always issuing kulas, leniencies. Very often there were stringencies, but everything that he did was original. But the psak that really got people's attention was about artificial insemination. It was an emerging process, gynecological process, and it was extremely controversial. And Rav Moshe Feinstein said, you're allowed to go through artificial insemination, but on one condition. The donor has to be a Gentile. Can't be a Jew. Why? So he had a number of reasons, but the logic is based on the possibility of mamzerut, of people who are related to each other, getting married unknowingly as a result of artificial insemination, something that would be highly reduced if the donor wasn't Jewish. From a Jewish legal standpoint, a Gentile donor is better. This was his psak, very controversial, but one which was becoming more widely known and eventually used. The Satmar Rebbe launched a campaign against Rav Moshe Feinstein. This is not widely known. And I've searched for original research on this. It's really, on the corners of the dark web you can find information, but no one really talks about it. You're going to think to yourself, well, who cares? I'll tell you why. Because they tried to burn down his yeshiva. And they issued bomb threats against his apartment building. They had to evacuate the entire apartment building in the Lower East Side. And people would come into the yeshiva and start hitting the bochrim and tearing books off the shelf. We're not talking about some gentle campaign that was being waged in the columns of a newspaper. This was a vicious campaign to discredit Rav Moshe Feinstein. In 1964, the Satmar Rebbe sent a letter, to the Helmutzer Rebbe, Rabbi Hananya Yom Tov Lippe Deutsch. I remember he used to come and visit Gated Yeshiva when I was there. He wrote a vast, many volumes of books on mikvahs, an incredible man. And he had written to the Satmar Rebbe about artificial insemination, Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuva, and the Satmar Rebbe responded in a letter in which he railed against Rav Moshe Feinstein. How dare he permit this? By the way, that is the letter. I have the original publication, if you see it here. Eventually, the aggression was so bad that they needed to calm things down. A meeting was called between Rav Moshe Feinstein and a delegation of Rabbonim from Satmar. By the way, it's just over the bridge. If you know New York, Williamsburg is just over the bridge from the Lower East Side. And the delegation was led by a man called the Ten Karov, Reb Shlomo Zalman Friedman. I'll tell you why that's interesting. The Ten Karov was so impressed by Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he was Hungarian from Marmarosh, and he was so impressed by Rav Moshe Feinstein, he became devoted to him, absolutely devoted to him after this meeting. And in fact, his daughter, Chana, has for 40 years been the one who runs the Yeshiva Mesifta Tiferes Yerushalayim. But I'm going to tell you what happened at this meeting. I've spoken to 3 or 4 people who attended the meeting. The apartment was absolutely packed. They were scared. This Rav Moshe Feinstein's friends were scared that a bunch of ruffians would come, and if they didn't like what Rav Moshe Feinstein would say, he'd be in physical danger. So they packed the apartment with people to protect him. And the rabbis, 3 rabbis came from Williamsburg, their own delegation. I won't mention the other names. I wanted to mention the Ten Karov because, Zochur Latoiv. And they tried to prove Rav Moshe Feinstein wrong, speaking to him in learning. And time after time, he rebuffed them gently, but he was extremely firm. He wasn't going to give in. They told him, and I heard this from all the sources I spoke to, that this is the exchange that happened after 20 minutes or half an hour of speaking in learning. They told him that the Satmar Rebbe had warned them not to try to talk to him in learning because they would never win. And he smiled, and they said the following to him, that if the heter of artificial insemination was accepted in the Satmar community, Satmar girls would stop marrying Satmar boys because they could have babies without getting married to a Satmar chassid. Serious. To which he responded, I think there are other reasons why Satmar girls marry Satmar boys. I don't think you have to worry. The meeting was over, things died down, the lines had been drawn, and Rav Moshe Feinstein was the posek hador, but the Hasidim, as a result of the opposition of the Satmar Rebbe, remained wary of him, and they began to retain their own system and not use him, because even if he came out with a psak, which was a good psak, it wouldn't be accepted in the Satmar community. Rav Moshe Feinstein went to the Knesset Gedolah in 1964. Knesset Gedolah was the gathering of all the rabbis of the Aguda movement, and he came, it was his one and only time in Israel. This is a picture of him getting off the plane in Lud airport. You can see his Rebbetzin in the background. He's standing next to Rabbi Ruderman. And during his visit, he requested, or they requested, the Eidach HaRedus and him should have a meeting. They said, we can't meet with you. Eidach HaRedus is the Beis Din of the anti-Zionist community in Jerusalem. We can't meet with you publicly. We'll meet with you at one of our homes late at night. And they had this meeting. And he said, he can't understand why the Satmar Rebbe was so opposed to him. It doesn't make any sense. I used to meet on a regular basis with the Satmar Rebbe. Surely if he had something to say to me, he would have said it to me directly. Why would he have waged this horrible battle against me? And now it's over, but why did he do it? And they told him something quite shocking. And I heard this from somebody who was at that meeting. They said to him that this had nothing to do with artificial insemination. They said everything to do with Rav Moshe Feinstein. Reb Aaron Kotler had been the Gadol Hador together with the Satmar Rebbe until 1962. When he died, clearly Rav Moshe Feinstein was going to become the Gadol Hador. Reb Aaron Kotler had posed no danger to the Hasidic community because his influence there was limited. But Rav Moshe Feinstein's influence within the Hasidic community was vast. And therefore, he needed to discredit him in order to get control of his own community, to make sure, and by the way, we're going to get to that and see what it means in a minute, to make sure that his community would remain loyal to him. Because if you're relying just on halacha, Rav Moshe Feinstein is always going to win. And therefore, he picked the most vulnerable of all the psukim of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which was this one about artificial insemination, and waged a campaign against that. But it was never about that. Why didn't he choose the one about having cholav stam, about milk that's unsupervised, or the mechitza one? Because it's quite easy to offer and say, listen, you want to have cholav stam if you live in Arkansas, you're not going to have shomered milk, you're not going to have cholav Yisrael milk. Obviously, it doesn't mean you. And very often, by the way, in a tshuva, Rav Moshe Feinstein would say, this tshuva is not for a ben Torah. This tshuva is the halacha. If you want to be makpid on yourself, you have every right to do so. Similarly with the mechitza. Obviously it doesn't apply to a Satmar Stiebel in Williamsburg, because there they don't even have a mechitza. The women don't come to shul. If they do, they sit in a different room. But it does apply to a rabbi who's a rabbi in Kentucky, or even somewhere in Pennsylvania where they want to separate the shul out. We need to give them the halachic parameters of a mechitza, so those psukim are not a danger to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's authority. But the one about artificial insemination is. Now you have to understand something. The methodology of the Satmar Rebbe is completely different than the methodology of the Litvak community in one very specific area. It's all about recreating the environment of Europe, this ideal environment of the Hasidic community in Europe, which, by the way, never even existed in Satmar. You know, the main shul in Satmar was Ashkenaz, and all the people shaved and were not Hasidic. The Satmar Rebbe had his own little shtibel at home. But to recreate that community, you need to be able to retain distance between yourself and the outside world. It's not about halacha. It's about hashkafa. It is about maintaining the standard of Jewish identity not about the strict application of halakha, which might allow things which in the hashkafa world would never be allowed. Therefore, there needed to be clear blue water between the Satmar community, which had begun to rely on Rav Moshe Feinstein's psukim, and that community which did rely on them and continues to do so. So now we come back to I just want to tell you one story. It's an important story. It was a latecomer. There's a man called Rabbi Mordechai Savitsky. He was the only Litvak rabbi who stood alongside the Satmar community in opposing Rav Moshe Feinstein during the 1960s. He was a rabbi in Boston. He'd studied under the Chofetz Chaim in Radin. He was an anti-Zionist. He was a brilliant scholar. Occasionally controversial. He got into quite a dispute with Rabbi Yosheber, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik in Boston over kashrus, which, by the way, was a standard source of controversy. I never know where I am when I use that word. In America at that time. In any event, he wrote a vicious article against Rav Moshe Feinstein in Hamaor. Hamaor was a monthly rabbinic publication. This is the article, I found it. And he was the only Litvak to challenge Rav Moshe Feinstein's supremacy. It was very offensive to the family. They were deeply hurt and upset. Anyway, years later, he was accused of tax evasion. The IRS had him arrested. It's a felony. It's a jailable offense. And one day he knocked on Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's door. The grandson, Mordechai Tendler, was there to meet him. He said, "Oh, hello." He said, "Is your grandfather in?" He came in, marched into Moshe Feinstein's room. It says 1971. And he says, he didn't apologize. He said, "You know who I am?" He says, "Right, Mordechai Savitsky." He says, "I'm in very deep trouble. I've heard that the judge in my case knows you and has a lot of respect for you. Will you write a letter to the judge to say that I'm a man of good character?" And he says, "Why?" He says, "Because if you don't, I will go to jail. The judge is the only one who can make sure I don't go to jail." Took out a pen, wrote a letter to the judge, gave it to him, and he leaves, no apology. As he's going out the door, the Rebbitzin was coming in from shopping. And she runs in, she says, "What was he doing here?" He told him. He told her he might go to jail, he needs my help. "You gave him a letter? Remember what he wrote about you? Remember what he said about you? The man is a Jewish man, he needs help. My letter can help, of course I'll write him a letter." That was Rav Moshe Feinstein. He's a very, very great man. Anyway, back to Maaneh Le'igros, and hopefully we're coming to the end. Rabbi Yom Tov Halevi Schwartz. I searched on the internet for information about him. There's a lot of misinformation about him. He is the author of this book of more than 160 teshuvos using terrible language against Rav Moshe Feinstein. He was born in Poland. He studied in Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. You know what the entrance exam was, Chachmei Lublin? You had to know 200 daf of Gemara by heart and go through a test on all 200 daf. That was the test. He was so young. This is what his son told me. I eventually spoke to his son on Sunday. He was 15 years old, that when he went into the yeshiva, they didn't believe he passed the test. So they sent him again, and he took the test twice. He was an absolute genius. In 1939, he was just 18 years old. He was trapped in Poland by the Nazi invasion. He tried to escape, but he couldn't escape. And he went to the border with a bunch of friends. The border is about 20 miles away from a city called Chelm. And this was the site of the first, next to the river Bug, the site of the first Holocaust, of the first massacre of the Holocaust. They took the community of Chelm. They said they want all men, or boys and men from age 15 to 60. Take off all your clothes and run to the river Bug, which is 20 miles away, 25 kilometers away. And they ran, and anybody who dropped, they shot or they beat to death. There were hundreds of men and boys, eventually the remnant of whom made it to the river Bug. On the other side of the river Bug, as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, were Russian soldiers. And the Germans said, swim across the river and go to the other side, go to Russia. And they tried to get to the other side, and the Russian soldiers began to shoot, not them, in the air. So, please, you save our lives. They've just killed a whole bunch of us. You can't come. We're told we're not allowed to let any Jews into the country. So they went back, if you can imagine, into Germany. This was a test case to see what would happen if the Jews attempted to escape from Nazi atrocities. This is where Rabbi Yom Tov Schwartz was in 1939. He witnessed, he didn't witness the actual massacre, but the people who came back, he heard the story from them. It's been verified independently. He went to Krakow, he caught typhus, almost died. He managed somehow through the intervention of a Polish doctor to survive typhus, and he wanted to go home. Guess where he was from? A place called Auschwitz. He went to Auschwitz, which they then evacuated to the ghetto in Bendin, where he was for 2 years. He then spent the remainder of the war in concentration camps. He was in 9 different concentration camps. He was liberated in May 1945 in Germany. His entire family was wiped out. He didn't know of a third cousin, never mind a second cousin or first cousin, or any siblings or uncles or aunts or anything. He became a rabbi for refugees, survivors in Lüneburg in Germany. And in 1951, he came to the United States. Had absolutely no knowledge of anybody there. He wasn't a Litvak from a Litvish yeshiva. All of Polish Jewry had been killed. He wasn't a Chassid. He didn't belong to any Hasidic group, although his family was Belz. He wasn't part of the modern Orthodox world. He had no natural home. He just had him, his wife, and the children. Eventually became a rabbi in an area of Queen called Jackson Heights, which is near LaGuardia Airport. It's a 20-minute walk from LaGuardia Airport. He opened up a shul in his home, Nachlas Yaakov, and he was the rabbi of that shul. It was a modern Orthodox shul, some type of convenience minyan. It wasn't a shul of great talmidei chachomim. He didn't mix with anyone in particular. I guess he went here and there from time to time. But within his own bubble, he considered himself, and perhaps rightly so from that perspective, as one of the greatest Jewish scholars, rabbinic scholars in America. He's a man who at the age of 15 had gained entry into Lublin Yeshiva by knowing 200 Daf Baal Peh. There wasn't an area of Jewish learning that he wasn't familiar with. One day, in the late 1960s or early 70s, he picked up a copy of Igros Moshe. And what he read made him absolutely crazy. How can a rabbi ignore a psak of the Chassam Sofer? He lives 150 years later. What gives him the right of undermining a psak from such a great rabbi? Who does he think he is? And every tshuva he read, every single thing that he read convinced him more and more that Moshe Feinstein is a grave danger to the future of Jewish life. He didn't have anyone to discuss it with. He began writing his sefer. And in the sefer, it's a very sad sefer. That is the truth. It's a long introduction. I've got here one quote from the introduction. Can you imagine an upstanding Jewish woman who uses Reb Moshe's psak could actually bear the son of a Nazi murderer who killed her own father or one of her relatives in Auschwitz? The pain of that sentence is unbelievable. But then he goes on to issue the vilest and most terrible insults against Rav Moshe Feinstein. Not being familiar with that kind of literature. He wasn't polite or generous-spirited in dismissing what he saw as the mistakes or liberties made or taken by Rav Moshe Feinstein. He just wanted to utterly annihilate him. But that ship had sailed. The fight was over. He'd never published anything before. No one had ever heard of him. No one knew him. He had no natural friends. He had no money. There was only a couple of publishers in New York in those days who would agree to publish anything like that. One of them was the publisher who published Rav Moshe Feinstein's Sforim. And he called him up. I don't know if innocently or not innocently. It's not clear to me. And it's Rav Moshe Feinstein's publisher, and he says, I've got a book which I've written, which is against all the psokim of Rav Moshe Feinstein. The publisher was a little bit hesitant, but then he remembered that he also published Hama'or. Remember Rabbi Savitsky's article was published in Hama'or. So, and he'd once phoned Rav Moshe Feinstein and asked him, am I allowed to publish this? Do you mind if I publish this journal because it contains articles against you? He says, I know Rabbi Amsel, he's the publisher, the editor of Hama'or, he needs it for Parnassa. If he needs it for Parnassa, you can publish it, not a problem. So, well, if Rabbi Amsel needed it for Parnassa, this Rabbi Schwartz certainly needed it for Parnassa, and he published the book. The thing is, they look almost identical. Here, I have a slide. The top one in that slide is the Igros Moshe from 1959. That's the first edition. The bottom one in the slide is Maaneh Le'igros. Can you tell them apart? They're exactly the same size and layout. I don't know if it was done deliberately. The family claims not. It's not clear to me. Only 2 stores carried this book that would agree to carry a book against Rav Moshe Feinstein. One of them was Biegeleisen. Biegeleisen still exists. Any of you ever been to Biegeleisen? Here's a picture of me and Menachem Butler in Biegeleisen in 2010. It's still there. It's piled up with books. It's a tiny store on 17th Avenue, or 16th Avenue in Borough Park. The other one was the Sforim store, which belonged to Rabbi Yossel Ashkenazi, who was the Gabbai of the Satmar Rebbe, who was still alive but very sick at that time. But within weeks, both of those stores, first they ran out of the books, people read through the books, didn't like it, they wouldn't restock them. I asked the family what happened to the book. They said they published 2,000. He said maybe they managed to sell and get rid of 1,000. The rest remain in storage somewhere in a warehouse in the United States. Now you don't need to buy them anymore because somebody has very generously PDF'd the book and it's available online. So I always thought that my one was worth a fortune, apparently not. Anyway, what did Rav Moshe Feinstein say? He took the book, somebody brought it to him, and he read it, and he laughed. He says, I'm not worried about this. They said, why don't you write a refutation? Why don't you write a piece which refutes all the arguments that he brings in over 160 teshuvos, and they're brilliant, absolutely brilliant, full of incredible knowledge. He said, no, if I write a book, then people will need to buy his book to find out what it is that he wrote in order to find out why I'm refuting it. Don't worry, this book will die a natural death, and so it did. One major fan, I'm going to end with this, of Maaneh Le'igros was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He quotes him, I found it on the Bar Ilan disc, or the online Bar Ilan, 11 separate times quoted by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He wrote, on one of those occasions, even though he writes very favorably about the Torah knowledge of the author of the Maaneh Le'igros, he wrote, V'ra'isi sharav Maaneh Le'igros hissig ala Igros Moshe. I saw that the author of the Maaneh Le'igros objects to something written by Rav Moshe Feinstein. Ella, shahaya lo ledaber beloshen kovod. He should have spoken more respectfully. Klape Hagon Hanal about Rav Moshe Feinstein. Uvachol Sifroi Metiach Dvarim Koshim Umorim Klapov. And in his entire book, he writes the most terrible things against him. V'chein lo yaseh. That is not the way to do it. I think that's a good moment to end. Thank you so much.